Hi, I'm Kevin.
And I'm Stephanie. And now we're going to give you some tips and tricks about casting epoxy. So let's get started. The most important thing is the mold. So Kevin's going to bring out a mold that we have going right now to make a door, so we can give you kind of a visual while he tells you about it.
All right, so this is a door actually that I'm working on. I know it looks really skinny, but this is a really fun trick that makes no mess. It's a very easy way to do an epoxy river. So what you do is you build an actual mold out of wood, covered in tuck tape, silicone in all the joints, and you screw it all together. And then you place your two pieces of wood on opposite edges, so you have the river that you'd like. And then afterwards, you can actually add the rest of the pieces to finish your door. Now you can't do this with a solid slab, but you can do it with our Timberlink. So another thing that was a lesson hard learned for myself is that wood does float in epoxy. So you can see some marks on here, and what you want to do is you want to put clamps on in order to stop the wood from floating, because it's completely encapsulated and it's not being supported by the wood, and the wood is floating inside this mold. If you fill it right to the top, the whole wood will rise up, and then if you try to push it back down, it'll introduce tons of air into your epoxy. It's not something that you want. So I had a clamp here about every foot. So before you start to pour your epoxy, the very first thing you want to do once your wood is in your mold and it's clamped in is you want to set it perfectly level. Now, this one, for example, was off a little bit, so we actually had to sand it down and add a little bit on this end here. So you can see here that it was sanded, and you can see that actually the whole river was sanded, and you can see that once I reapplied the epoxy, you cannot tell that I sanded, so you don't have to worry about this.
Okay, so Kevin's going to give us some mixing tips now.
Can you pass me the cup? Thank you. Okay, so mixing tip number one, use a clear cup. Now, a clear cup will give you better view of the mixture in the epoxy. Now, when you mix it, first of all, I recommend you pour slowly to introduce less air into it. And when you mix, you want to mix slowly, because if you're whipping it around like you're beating an egg, it's going to introduce tons and tons of air into the epoxy that you'll have to get out afterwards. So the less air you have in there, the less work you have cut out for yourself. The other thing is when you're mixing, you want to make sure that you're scraping the sides and the bottom periodically. And I always like to just go and scrape the epoxy off my stick like this. And a lot of time I'll see that my epoxy is perfectly clear, it's perfectly mixed, and then I'll scrape my stick, and then I'll see some lines again in my epoxy that shows me that the epoxy on my stick was not properly stirred. So then I go back and I keep stirring. And I wouldn't recommend stirring less than 3 minutes. You have a pot life with this epoxy about an hour, so you do not have to worry about it gelling up on you real quick and getting stuck in your tub and ruining that epoxy.
And then also regarding pigments, like Kevin said in our previous video, is that you want to mix in the pigments after you've already stirred for the 3 minutes that he's recommending.
Another really fun tip is, because our epoxy is so thin and so water-like, after mixing, if you just let your cup just sit there for 10-15 minutes and you come back to it, you'll actually see that most of the air has come out already on its own.
So speaking of air bubbles, let's talk about how you should be pouring it into your cast, and how do you deal with bubbles if they do show up when you're casting.
So the great thing about timber cast is the bubbles will pop themselves. Now, if you're pouring extremely thick, 3-4 inches, you're going to want to really go easy on your pour, introduce as little air as you can, and maybe even pour, let's say, 1 inch and let it sit, and then pour a little bit more just to let that air get out, because the thicker your epoxy is, the harder it is for the air to climb back out of it.
Okay, so I'm going to give you one of my tips. To protect your floors, we use a vapor barrier, and trust me, you want to use this because I have epoxy on my basement floor that I will never forget about Kevin's projects. So this vapor barrier is great, it's inexpensive, and the epoxy does not stick to it. So if you put this down on your floor, it can spill over, we've actually reused epoxy that has fallen onto the vapor barrier, and it's become some of our best projects. And later on, if you want to reuse it, just let the epoxy dry on the vapor barrier. You can just peel it off and then reuse it again.
And if you do have any unmixed epoxy that gets on the vapor barrier or anything else, it can very easily be cleaned up with denatured alcohol.
So how do you do clear? How can you get it crystal clear?
So if you're trying to do a perfectly crystal clear river all the way through, it's pretty much the hardest thing to do. If you want to pull that project off, make sure that you seal everything 100%. If you think it's perfect, just do it one more time just to make sure. Let it set, let it completely dry, sand it, and then do your pour. Because if there's any air coming out of the wood at all, it's going to get into the epoxy and you will see it. Now, there's micro bubbles are fairly common. You won't see them dead on, but if you're looking at your river on the edge, then you'll be able to see them because of the way that the light is refracting in there. But no one will ever know they're there except you.
So how do you do a 3D cast?
So a 3D cast is simply a 2-layer pour, or you can go even more with 2-3 layers. For example, this table here, we actually made this for trade shows, and we wanted to show off the color and the clarity of our product. So we have filled it with our sonic blue, put a design into it, and once the epoxy gelled and was nice and tacky, we went over it and added just a clear.
So here are my tips for how to have a successful casting project and what are the best items from us to buy. So on this bar top table that we have here, we actually used our Timberlink. We have used our edge pieces, so these are 6-foot pieces. We have 2 edge pieces joined here, and then another 2 pieces joined here, and then we have our river down the center. And then the one that I've mentioned previously is our oval. So this one is a great beginner's project, but it looks amazing. So all of our ovals usually have kind of a pizza slice cut out of them. So it requires a smaller kit. You can do this with our 750 milliliter kit. It's gonna be one single small pour. It's an easier mold to make as well, and this one has great results. So we hope that these tips and tricks have helped you with your next epoxy project. If you have any more questions, feel free to call us at 819-281-8423. You can always send us an email at info@liveedgetimber.com if ever you have any more questions. Thanks for tuning in.